What if the thing you're most afraid of isn't a war? What if it's what happens the morning after one almost starts? Because here's what nobody tells you. The most dangerous moment in any conflict between major powers isn't when the bombs fall. It's the 72 hours before anyone knows if they will. That's when the real damage happens. Not to buildings, to systems, to the invisible architecture that keeps your paycheck arriving, your grocery store stocked, and your savings worth something. And right now, that architecture is under more pressure than it's been in a very long time. Let's talk about the US and Iran. Not the politics, not the ideology, the economics, the money, the quiet, trembling machinery underneath everything that most people never see until it stops working. Iran sits on something the modern world cannot function without, not metaphorically, literally. About 20% of the world's oil passes through a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz. It's barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and Iran shares its coastline. Every day, roughly 17 million barrels of crude oil move through that corridor. Every single day. The moment there's a serious military escalation between the US and Iran, that number doesn't just dip. It threatens to go to zero. And when that happens, the ripple doesn't stop at the gas pump. Think about what oil actually powers. Not just cars, factories, shipping containers crossing the Pacific, the fertilizer that grows the food in your supermarket, the plastic in your phone case, the heating in your home. Oil isn't just energy. It's the connective tissue of the global economy. And there's a handful of countries with their hand dangerously close to the scissors. Now here's the part that should really make you pause. Markets don't wait for wars to start. They price in the possibility. The mere tension, the rhetoric, the satellite images, the leaked intelligence briefings, all of it moves numbers before a single shot is fired. In the weeks when US-Iran tensions have spiked historically, oil has moved 10, 15, even 20% in a matter of days. And oil moving that fast doesn't just hurt, it cascades. Airlines renegotiate, trucking companies pass costs down, shipping rates climb, and slowly, almost invisibly, the cost of everything you buy starts to creep upward. This is inflation that doesn't come from your central bank printing money. It comes from fear, from uncertainty, from the markets doing what markets always do when they sense instability. They charge you for the risk. And here's what's unsettling about the current moment. We are already in an inflationary environment in most Western economies. Central banks have been walking a razor's edge, trying to bring prices down without crushing growth. Interest rates are higher than they've been in decades in some countries. Consumer debt is elevated. Corporate debt is elevated. The cushion that existed in 2019 to absorb an external shock, it's thinner, much thinner. So when people say a US-Iran escalation could crash everything, they're not being dramatic. They're describing a system that's already stressed being hit by a freight train. But let's go deeper than oil, because that's the obvious part. What most people never consider is the currency dimension. The dollar. Right now, the US dollar functions as the world's reserve currency. Nearly 90% of all global currency transactions involve the dollar on at least one side. When you buy oil in Tokyo or Jakarta or Sao Paulo, you buy it in dollars. This is the system that has been in place since Bretton Woods in 1944, and it gives the United States extraordinary power. The ability to sanction, the ability to freeze assets, the ability to essentially cut a country off from the global financial system. Iran has been living under that pressure for decades. They know what it feels like to be locked out of SWIFT, the international payment system. They know what it means to have reserves frozen. And in response, they've been doing something that most Western analysts quietly acknowledge but rarely discuss openly. They've been building workarounds. With Russia, with China, with other countries that have their own reasons to want an alternative to dollar dominance. This is the slow-moving story beneath the fast-moving crisis. Every time the US and Iran come to the brink, it accelerates that conversation. It pushes more countries to ask, what happens to us if we're on the wrong side of American foreign policy one day? Do we want our entire economy to be this vulnerable? And here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. China holds over $1 trillion in US Treasury bonds. It is simultaneously deepening its trade relationship with Iran, quietly, despite sanctions. Russia and Iran have developed oil-for-goods arrangements that bypass the dollar entirely. The BRICS bloc, whatever you think of it politically, is actively discussing alternatives to dollar-denominated trade. None of this happens overnight. None of this crashes the system tomorrow. But every escalation between the US and Iran is another brick being quietly removed from the foundation. Now let's bring this back to something human, something you can feel. Imagine you're a small business owner in Ohio or Manchester. You import components from Asia. You run on thin margins. Your supplier quotes you a price in January. By March, shipping costs have spiked because fuel surcharges went up, because oil jumped 15%, because there was a drone strike near a tanker in the Persian Gulf. Your quote is now your loss. You either absorb it or you pass it on. And if you pass it on, your customer, the person who was going to renovate their bathroom or finally buy that piece of equipment they needed, hesitates, pulls back, decides to wait. And that hesitation, multiplied across millions of decisions, shows up as a contraction in GDP 6 months later, not because of the war, because of the possibility of the war. This is the mechanism nobody explains. Fear doesn't just live in the mind. It lives in spreadsheets, in purchasing orders, in hiring freezes, in the quiet conversations between CFOs who start building in contingency margins for scenarios that didn't exist in their models 18 months ago. And then there's the energy transition dimension. Because here's an irony that doesn't get enough airtime. The West has been trying, genuinely trying, to reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern oil through renewables, through electric vehicles, through policy. But that transition takes time. It takes a decade, maybe two. In the meantime, the dependency hasn't gone away. It's just been partially obscured. The infrastructure for that transition, the metals, the rare earths, the manufacturing capacity, is itself concentrated in geopolitically sensitive regions. You solve one vulnerability and discover 3 more underneath it. So the crisis isn't just about Iran. It's about the moment the world realizes the system it built on a certain set of assumptions is now operating in a world where those assumptions no longer hold. Think about trust for a second. The entire global financial system runs on trust, not gold, not oil. Trust. The trust that $1 held today will be worth roughly $1 tomorrow. The trust that the bond market will function. The trust that supply chains will deliver. The trust that the institutions managing these systems are competent and credible. Every geopolitical crisis nibbles away at that trust. Most of the time, not enough to notice. But occasionally, in the wrong conditions with the wrong combination of pressures, the trust erosion reaches a threshold. And systems that seemed stable reveal themselves to have been fragile all along. We've seen it before, not always in war. Sometimes in a single bank failure that no one thought would matter. Sometimes in a currency peg that breaks overnight. The pattern is always the same. Everything seems fine until the day it suddenly isn't. And by the time most people realize what happened, the decision point has already passed. Here's what I want you to sit with. The US and Iran have been in a state of managed tension for over 4 decades. That tension has become almost background noise. We've learned to tune it out. But the world around that tension has changed. The debt levels have changed. The reserve currency dynamics have changed. The geopolitical alignments have changed. The climate pressures on energy systems have changed. What used to be a manageable regional confrontation now sits at the center of a web of interdependencies that didn't exist 30 years ago. And that means the stakes of miscalculation are genuinely different now. Not just higher in a vague, rhetorical sense. Higher in a specific, traceable, economic sense that would show up in your mortgage rate, your electricity bill, your retirement account, your ability to find a job in a contraction. This isn't about fear. It's about understanding what's actually connected to what. Because the people who get hurt first in any serious economic disruption aren't the ones at the top of these systems. They're insulated. They have diversified assets. They have access to information earlier. The people who get hurt first are the ones who never saw it coming. The ones who trusted that the background noise would stay background noise. The ones for whom the system worked just well enough, just reliably enough, that they never had reason to question its fragility. And that is a pattern worth understanding. Not to panic, not to predict, but to see clearly. There's a reason the economists and analysts who watch these systems closely don't sleep well during escalation cycles. Not because they know exactly what will happen, but because they understand the mechanism. And the mechanism right now has very little room for error. If any of this made you curious about how the deeper architecture of global economics really works, the oil markets, the dollar system, the debt cycles, the quiet decisions that reshape ordinary life, then keep following this channel. That's exactly what we dig into. The stories beneath the stories, the systems behind the headlines, explained in a way that actually makes sense. Because the most important things happening in the world right now are almost never the things making the most noise.